The Mayo Experience.
Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience. Basketball season is upon us, and frankly, I don't know a ton about the NBA as it pertains to playing on DraftKings. So I hope that you guys who are watching this video or listening to this podcast are in the same boat as me, and hopefully you can learn a little bit. So immediately, smash the like button. Goes a long way to help me continuing to roll these out for every different sport, even the ones that I don't know a ton about. But the ones to help me break this down and educate us, and hopefully the masses out there, Drew Dinkmeyer and Mike Leone, co-creators, co-founders of DailyRoto.com. And if you go to DailyRoto.com right now and use the promo code THEPME, you get yourself 10% off. You know, that's a nice exchange that we got going on right here. The viewers of the show, you listen to Drew and Mike, you get yourself 10% off. Boom. Hopefully you can win a little bit at NBA. Drew, what's going on, man?
I'm very excited for the start of NBA season. I'm a huge NBA fan, and I'm a huge Pat Mayo fan. So this is a great way to start the NBA season for me.
Listen, you're already on the show. You don't need to suck up now. Leone, from the outside looking in, it always appears to me like the people that are the best DraftKings players, the pro DraftKings players, absolutely clean up at NBA. Why is that?
I think NBA is a bit more predictable. You don't have these high variance scoring events where in baseball, for example, a 400 football could be a home run and a slate winning event, or it could be a fly out to the warning track. And it's such a huge discrepancy in points over something that, you know, the player at the end of the day had very little control over, whether it scraped over the wall or found the outfielder's mitt. You know, same thing with football. A guy gets, you know, tackled at the 1 yard line instead of scoring a touchdown, things like that. Whereas basketball, you don't have any single event that's worth, way more points than another event. You know, a point is worth 1 point, a rebound's 1.25 points, and assists 1.5 points. And these things kind of even out. So if you have a 3-pointer and it rims out, it's not making or breaking your day like some of these other events. And the other thing too is opportunity. There's just a lot more chances for players to create points. And the minutes is something that you'll hear people hit on quite often. I know Al Zeidenfeld says minutes equals money, and that's the big thing to follow for NBA. So I think the opportunity that players are receiving, so they have many chances to accrue fantasy points and things, and variance can smooth out. And just the way the scoring works, it favors a more predictable outcome, and a more predictable outcome, I think, is going to favor the sharper players.
So, Drew, the first time I met Al was at one of these FSTA conferences like 5-6 years ago. And I didn't really know who he was. DFS was just becoming like a bigger thing at the time. And he turned around, I was just chatting with him. He turned around on the screen. He's like, hey, I just won $78,000. I was like, what is going on here? I was like, how did you do that? And he just opened up this like Excel spreadsheet. He's like, yeah, well, this guy was supposed to play and then he didn't play. And here was the guy that I projected in to take most of his minutes. And he just like plugged him in like his algorithm. And all of a sudden he's like, yeah, he spit out the points as the greatest value on the DraftKings slate that day. And no one else played him. So I won all the money. Like, are minutes and opportunity really the first thing that you should be looking at?
Absolutely. That's the key to daily fantasy basketball, is knowing who's going to be on the floor a bunch and then who's going to have the ball in their hands a bunch. And opportunity is something that we talk about across all sports. You know, in football, we talk about it in the case of wide receivers with targets, with running backs with touches, and we talk about the opportunities to accrue points. The difference in NBA game is there's fewer players on the floor compared to football. And so the opportunities get more condensed. And you also have many, many more possessions in the NBA game. So, you know, your star NBA player is going to touch the ball, you know, over 50 to 60 times during the course of the game. Whereas in the NFL, they might touch the ball, 20 times. So you just have a lot more points and opportunities to rack up because there's condensed opportunity sets because there's only 5 guys on the floor at a time. So monitoring injury information is probably the number one skill associated with daily fantasy basketball, because you really have to be on top of understanding not only who's going to play on a given night, but who's going to benefit if that player is absent from the lineup. And sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's the immediate backup to that player, but sometimes it's also a little bit more nuanced in the sense that the player that's backing up the starter might not be a high usage player. They might get a bunch of minutes, but they might not necessarily take a lot of shots. So each situation is a little bit different, but understanding the injury report, understanding who's going to play and who's going to get the most minutes on every given slate is the most important way to approach daily fantasy basketball.
So outside of the dailyroto.com push alerts, which will just come to you, I've been getting all mine for football. It's fantastic. I'm doing the shows live, and then boom, I get an email. I'm like, oh yeah, this guy's out. Perfect. This is the guy that's filling in. So is the same thing available for the NBA? And where are the sources that you guys are actually pulling from? Like, are there Twitter lists that you have? Are there certain sites that you like to use to really aggregate all this injury information? Like, what's the best way to go about that?
Yeah, there's some aggregators out there that do a really good job. Like Fantasy Labs has a really good NBA account that follows all the news and information. I follow Twitter lists so that I can source all the information for our alerts that go out. So, for example, I have just a list of all the NBA team beat writers that I follow. I believe it's from Scott Mallory, who goes by Scott Reddick on NBA Twitter, basketball 25 to life. But I follow these lists of all these team beat writers, and I update them as the season goes on. Basically, that's where I get all my information. And we have tweet decks set up. We have multiple people on alerts on a given night. And we have people who, as soon as a situation is reported, we have basically one person updating the projections and another person sending the notice to subscribers via an alert system. And so that's how we keep people on top of it. We keep updating the projections as the information comes in, and that gives people the most up-to-date information to be able to make their decisions on.
You got to be careful Twitter searching CJ Miles when you want to find that injury information, though.
There's some keyword NBA player searches that you have to be very careful with. They're not always safe for work. They're not always safe to have your significant others around. CJ Miles is the most notable for sure. So thankfully he's a reserve player in Toronto this year, so not that big of a deal. Back when he was playing as a starter on the Pacers and stuff, it was a dicey tweet deck search.
Okay, so the injuries are key. If people don't know how to follow lists on Twitter, like you can actually kind of piggyback on other people's lists. Levitan's big on this for the NFL, where he has all of his injury. He has injury ones, he has stat ones. If you just go to Twitter, like the main page on Twitter, look at lists, you can see the list that people are a part of and the list that people follow. So if you just search through there, you can find all of those lists right away. So we have injuries, we have opportunity, and how those two things correlate. Mike, what else do we need to know right off the hop as it pertains to DraftKings NBA?
So the other component along with opportunity is going to be fantasy points per minute. And it's obviously very simple. Your fantasy points is going to equal how many minutes you play times how many fantasy points you're accruing per minute. So you can get a good sense of just how active a player is and how productive they are on a per minute basis, simply looking at their historical DraftKings fantasy points per minute scored. But there are some other things that might change, based on a situation. If you think the pace of a game is going to be up tempo, you're probably going to see an increase in fantasy points per minute. And going back to the injuries, not only is a guy benefiting from stepping into a role and seeing more minutes, but his usage rate, for example, might expand. And by usage rate, we mean the number of possessions that end with him taking a field goal attempt or a turnover. And, you have similar rates for assists, for rebounds, and those types of things could change day to day that could influence a player's fantasy points per minute up or down. You've also want to take into account the defense that they're facing. If you're going up against a top 5 defense versus a bottom 5 defense, you're going to see a significant change. And that type of DVP, we call it, we do it by position at Daily Roto. We look at a site called hoopstats.com that has it spelled out really nicely. And that helps us get an idea of where to move the needle on a player's production per minute based on the opponent that they're playing.
So, Drew, when we think about like NFL DraftKings, this is the way I can correlate it back so it makes sense to me. And if people are watching this for the first time, I think that everyone's kind of familiar with how DraftKings football works, and relating that into the other games, at least as a basis point to compare how strategy works, makes a lot of sense. It makes it intuitive for some people, but like pace of play in football is so big. You have two really fast teams playing each other. They're going to run 65 plays each, 70 plays each, whatever it is. You just know that follows along with DraftKings points. So in the NBA, when you see two like high-paced teams that are going to run and shoot early in the shot clock, fire off a lot of shots, the pace is really high. Are those the games that we want to target? And what's the best way to really find out that information? Is it like Vegas totals, or is it just sort of like go on dailyroto.com, look at the pace stats, and that's the better way to find this out?
Yeah, I mean, Vegas totals is going to lead you most of the way there on a given night, because those are all things that they're taking into account when they're deriving a total. And when you do see like an exponential effect a little bit when two really high-paced teams meet one another. You'll see these totals reach up into the 230s often, and most of the other totals on the slate will be in the 210s. So you'll have like a 20-point difference in terms of totals, and you'll see Vegas will lead you most of the way. We do have pace and other offensive advanced statistics on our site available for users and subscribers to check out, but Vegas will lead you most of the way there most of the time.
So how often when you're selecting your teams are you correlating lineups? Like, hey, this is a super high-paced game. I'm going to take the star on this team and like 2 periphery parts of the other side coming back. Is that game stacking still applicable in terms of NBA?
It is. It's interesting. The strategy in NBA is a little bit different than NFL simply because there's less correlation, right? Like, you might have a certain big man who gets a lot of his field goals from, like back when Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan were on the Clippers together. DeAndre Jordan, when he was going to have a big scoring night, it was most likely going to be from a lot of assists from Chris Paul. But you don't necessarily have that on every single team, and it's not like a quarterback wide receiver stack that you feel like you have to be compelled to do that in any one of your GPP lineups. But game stacking is still very much a thing. The difference with the NBA versus the NFL is NFL slate sizes are fairly stable. We know most NFL weeks we're going to have somewhere, around 10 to 11, 12 games. NBA slates vary differently throughout the whole course of the season. Some nights we'll have 3-game slates. Some nights we'll have 8-game slates. Some nights we'll have 10-game slates. Some nights we'll have 6-game slates. And the smaller the slate there is, the more likely the benefit to a potential game stack is in GPPs, simply because in the NBA, what you have the advantage of is not only pace of play, but if the game is playing close, you could have overtime equity, which is another 5 minutes on the clock for players to be able to accrue points. And on a shorter slate where there's 3 to 6 games or something like that, if you find the one game that goes into overtime, you automatically, because the starters almost always play the full 5 minutes in overtime, you automatically have like a 5-minute advantage on your opponents in terms of each player that you use from that game. So game stacking is a very popular, or probably not as popular in the NFL, but will be popular going forward. I think people are kind of catching on to that being a very strong GPP strategy.
Mike, can you dig into late swap a little bit on DK and how this can influence building your lineups and what you really need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, late swap is really important to utilize. So the main thing is you want to pay attention if one of your players gets scratched. You want to make sure you replace that player. Unlike any other sport, if you're taking a 0 in NBA, you're pretty much toast. You can survive it in some of the higher variance sports just because the scoring distributions on the other players can be so wide that somebody else might have a healthy player that, tanks, and you might have an outlier performance from one of your other players. That doesn't happen as much in NBA. You really need production from your lineup 1 through 9. And as a result, you got to be on top of that. But even more so than that, you can really frame your rosters around news that is going to come, but it might come after that 7 p.m. Eastern time initial lock when the first game locks. I know oftentimes we get slates where teams play at 7 p.m., 7:30, and there might be a whole slew of games that play at 8 p.m. So you want to keep those slots open if you think news is incoming, especially if you've got a West Coast game, for example, with LeBron James, and he's questionable on the second night of back-to-back. We're not sure if he's going to play. You want to structure your lineup so not only can you take out LeBron James if he doesn't play and replace him, but so many of the other players on the Lakers are going to benefit both in terms of playing time, and LeBron has such a high usage rate, high assist rate, even a pretty strong rebounding rate. There's going to be a lot more opportunity available in the main 3 stats, points, assists, and rebounds for these players that are also playing more minutes. So you want to be able to use the cap relief of these players. And then if you get these strong value plays, you need to have a spot open for a stud so you really fully take advantage of it. So it is something that you can construct your rosters in a way where if news is incoming, you just give yourself that added flexibility. But aside from doing that type of thing, the other important thing is just to monitor where you are in your contests. If you and I are playing head to head and it's at the end of the night, you're up by 5 points on me. We've both got $8,000 left for our last player. It's a guard. I can deduce it's probably the same player. I want to swap off to any other player, just because I want to give myself a chance. Because if we're playing the same player and you're up by 5, you're probably going to win, especially if everything else is done, then you're 100% going to win. So you have these extra outs both in cash games and in tournaments. So knowing your spot in the standings and being able to sort of reverse engineer the lineups of some of the teams in front of you is really going to help know whether you should swap, even if there isn't injury news.
So, Drew, Mike hit on it that you want to leave yourself some flexibility in order to make this late swap, but that requires paying attention throughout the course of all these games, sitting by your computer right before these games start. Is there an easy way to kind of bridge that gap so you're just not, being a crazy person sitting at home in your basement the entire time? And is there besides like having a flex spot available and moving the later players into your flex spot like you would in football in order to do a late swap, is there any other way that you can get around this just a little bit to make things easier in life?
Yeah, so that's the first big one, is the fact that you've got a general utility spot on DraftKings, but you've also got a general guard spot and a general forward spot. And just leave those spots to the latest game players as much as you can, because it's almost like 3 utility spots with a lot of players carrying multiple position eligibilities and whatnot. So, fill up, if you're going to use players from early games, use those players in the dedicated positional slots: point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center, so on and so forth. And leave those more general spots available for you to take advantage of late swap. In terms of trying to make the process easier on yourself, if you're a player who doesn't want to be sitting by their computer all night, turn on your phone for email alerts from us specifically. You'll get those alerts, and we'll let you know when players are out, when projections are updated. And also in our alerts, we often let you know, okay, this player's out. Here are the players that we think are going to benefit most, and we've updated projections type thing. So we try to give you a little bit of context alongside the news message, and then let you know, hey, if you want to see the projections, they're updated on the site. But it is one of the differences among NBA. This year, hopefully, it's a little bit better because the league has done a better job at spreading out the schedule, so there's fewer back-to-backs for teams. Hopefully, injury reporting continues to improve. Last year, we saw a little bit of a step forward from the NBA in terms of teams releasing information a few hours before tip. Some teams are always going to be a problem because their coaches view this like the Bill Belichick style. We don't want to give anyone else any information that could possibly help them prepare. But hopefully the league continues to evolve in terms of the reporting, that we get information a little bit earlier. And most nights, most of the games are, 75% of the games are going to be tipped by 8 o'clock. So if you can schedule a little bit more of your time to hang out till 8 o'clock Eastern instead of 7 o'clock Eastern, that'll take care of like 75% of the way most nights.
So when we're constructing cash lineups, and cash lineups, either head-to-heads, 50-50s, triple-ups, that sort of thing, versus giant tournament lineups, Mike, what are the distinct differences this time around? Because generally speaking, people will say cash game lineups, you want that high floor, you just need to beat 49% of the field in these 50-50s, and all of a sudden you're a winner. And in the giant tournaments, you need to inherit more risk for those upside plays. But in basketball, how does that work? Because I think this would, I don't know if it would correlate more, but like, playing a NFL cash game lineup is severely different than playing a PGA cash game lineup, because frankly, I don't know how much of an edge there is in PGA 50-50s or double ups, because everyone is so high variance in terms of golf that there's no real distinction between a GPP lineup and a cash game lineup. How does it work in basketball?
Yeah, so if you've got PGA on one end of the spectrum and then you think NFL is away from that, I'd say NBA then is even further away from that. I think it's and maybe Drew disagrees here, but I think it's the sport that has probably the least difference between your tournament and your cash game lineups, just because, as we said, it's a little bit of a lower variant sport to begin with, and that applies to the individual player outcomes. So, I mean, mostly what I'm doing is I'm going to our Daily Roto projections, I'm sorting on our DraftKings value, and I'm building the best team that I can. There's not typically specific players I like to avoid or not play. I will say, if I can get away from using a crazy studs and duds lineup, all things equal, then I'll try and do that, just because I think there's a little bit more upside equity in building a balanced lineup, and upside still matters in cash games. And I think the floor ceiling combination sometimes when you can get these 5K-ish type players is a little bit better than if you have to take some of these sub 4K punts. The difficult part with that is the scoring really is skewed to favor the 10K plus studs. You do have to balance that. So I'm just talking like if you had two similarly projected lineups, I would go with the balanced lineup. But more times than not, I think they won't be similarly projected. So there's not too much of a difference in the types of players that I'm looking at. I'll manage my exposures differently in tournaments because if there's a shaky but good value play, we're not entirely sure the playing time. We think the guy's going to get the playing time. If they rate out as a really strong value, I still want to use them in my cash games. But if everyone's going to play this player, and I know there's some uncertainty there in tournaments, I'll go underweight. So I think your tournament strategy changes a bit. But as far as cash games go, you're just trying to mash in the best values that you possibly can. There are a few little things like guys that get into foul trouble a lot that you can use as tiebreakers, but there's not like one major sticking point where I'm like, I'm not going to use this type of player in cash games, but I'll use them in tournaments. Whereas in some of the other sports, that can be the case.
So, Drew, besides what Mike has hit on already, how much would ownership factor in to NBA GPP lineups? And is it as big of a thing? Because I guess on a smaller slate, it would be. On a larger slate, maybe not so much because it wouldn't be so concentrated. But how does that play into your strategy?
So ownership in almost all GPPs in all sports is super relevant. The challenge with NBA in projecting expected ownership is that the news changes so fast and changes the slate so quickly that oftentimes public ownership expectations or projections have a hard time keeping up with the news. And as a result can be somewhat nullified in terms of, you might have early on in the day a cheap player that we know they're replacing an injured player tonight that's very valuable and highly projected to be highly owned. But by the end of the night, there's 3 other values that end up popping up that are better than them, and that ends up suppressing that ownership. So I do not look at public ownership projections for NBA nearly as much as I do the other sports because I think it's a much tougher sport to project public ownership. That being said, it always matters in GPPs. There will often be times where you'll have players projected like a point or two apart. And in terms of ownership, they're 20 or 30 points apart in terms of ownership. And you always want, the leverage to be on your side of having the lower owned player when players project closely. So it is something to consider. It's just tougher to consider in NBA because the news changes the whole landscape of a slate very quickly. Some slates you'll prepare for the whole day and you'll say, there's no value out here whatsoever. You can't afford Russell Westbrook or James Harden. And then 15 minutes before lock, 3 guys are ruled out that you had no idea were going to be ruled out that night. And there's value. And now you can play Russell Westbrook and James Harden. And it's very difficult for public ownership projections to adjust fast enough to catch all that information.
Well, how do you think the public actually adjusts to that? So, now we're getting back into the late swap type of thing that if guys get ruled out at the last second, it opens up this value at the top. Do you see massive swings in ownership? Because even in the NFL, if a guy is ruled out as a surprise inactive at 11:30 in the morning, the guy who becomes the $3,500 chalk running back isn't quite as chalky as he would have been if this guy had been ruled out on Wednesday because people just don't pay attention that much. Do you find that it will still keep some of the ownership down off some of these what should be chalk plays but don't turn out to be because it happens last second?
Some, but not quite as much as NFL. The people who are playing NBA DFS are a little bit more hardcore about DFS and a little bit more hardcore about the NBA than the people who play NFL DFS. NFL DFS reaches a more casual fan base than probably any other sport. So you have a higher percentage of the people playing NBA DFS that are true hardcore DFS players and more likely to capture that news and act on it. Now, there still will be some lag time in terms of if you get an injury information 3 minutes before the lock of the game, that player is probably going to be less owned than one you got 25 minutes before a game starts. And certainly that one's going to be lesser owned than the one you get 2.5 hours before the game. There's still some effect on that in terms of lag time, but it is less so than in NFL simply because of the user base that's playing these games.
Mike, anything else you can think of that you want to add before we start looking at some of these tools?
I will say, and this feeds into our tools, but we do have range of outcome projections this year. And I think that's something that'll help a lot in making those, those leverage opportunities that Drew talks about in tournaments where the average projection for a player, you might have a clear, I think this opening slate on Tuesday is a good one. I know this is, an evergreen type thing, but Kevin Durant rates for us a much better value than Joel Embiid. But when you look at like their 90th percentile outcomes, it's really, really close. So that might be a reason for you to play a bit more Joel Embiid in tournaments than you would if you were just looking at the regular projections, especially because the ownership's probably going to follow accordingly and have Durant higher owned than Embiid. So I think those range of outcome projections that we have this year are going to be very useful.
Drew, anything else you think?
No, I think the one thing I'd add about late swap that I have found very valuable in the past is Not as much like reacting to news right before things hit, but just building yourself some extra time in terms of your analysis. So, most games lock are a set of games lock at 7 o'clock Eastern time on most slates. And I often use the 7 o'clock to 7:30 or 8 o'clock window to really finalize a lot of my decisions, where other games are kind of tipping a little bit later. So there's a couple different layers to how to leverage late swap correctly. But one of the things, just giving yourself a little bit of time. So I will always say, if there's two players that are projecting really similarly and one plays at 7 o'clock and one plays at 10 o'clock, I'd always rather take the later guy when I have late swap available to me.
All right, let's get into some of the tools at dailyroto.com. And remember, people, if you use the promo code PME. Get yourself 10% off this year for all Daily Roto stuff, NBA, NFL, anything you want. So, Drew, take me through the first steps. And when you open up the optimizer inside Daily Roto, where's the first place I should really be looking?
The first thing you'll want to do is you'll want to select your slate. So we've selected the DraftKings main slate for this first Tuesday opening night 2-game slate. And then from there, you'll see that all the projections are available to you. You can see the ability to create groups or team limits or settings up in the top right. But I always like to sort by value to just see who are the players that are projecting as the best values. And you can sort by points as well. Those are the ways that I like first settle in and kind of look at the projections. And then from there, I start digging in on some of the more particulars, like the minutes projections or the usage projections, or looking at the total projections in terms of players' points, rebounds, assists. Some of that is very useful for prop betting as well. But that's usually where I start before I start looking at creating groups and settings and running the optimizer.
Mike, where should we be looking in here? So beyond what Drew just said, like, do we want to be looking at the totals for the games? Do we want to be manually adjusting those? Because you can do that, right?
Yes, I think that's an important thing to know is if you go to that top grid, you've got all the games for the slate. And I think it's really good when you first start just to get acclimated with the type of setup that you're having. Now, it's just a 2-game slate, but on a full game slate, we talked about game stacking earlier. So you might want to find some games with high totals, tight point spreads. Those are always good to target for game stacking. You might also want to identify some spots that, maybe there's some blowout risk. Golden State at home as big favorites. 2-game slate, you're not quite as worried about that type of stuff. But in general, I think that's a really good spot to check. And unlike last year, this year we have tied the specific individual player projections for points, rebounds, and assists to our targets for the team for the night. So you'll notice OKC, for example, on the opening night, 109 team total we're projecting. But if we move that up to, let's say, 113, which you can do, the projection for Russell Westbrook is changing his overall DraftKings points, and specifically the real life points are changing, and that's feeding into the projection. And similarly, if you wanted to bump the assists, you'll see his assists right now are 8.8. If we bump the team assists to 24, now he's at 10.2 assists. So it changes according to, basically like in football, when we talk about market share of targets, for example, behind the scenes, it's like market share of team points, market share of team rebounds. So a player's statistics will adjust accordingly. So I think that's really cool if you think a game might be higher scoring than expected, or even lower scoring if it's the second night of a back-to-back, you think a team's tired, you can lower the expected point total there. So I think that's a really cool feature, and I think it's going to also improve accuracy, having things tied to the team level projections. But if you wanted to change an individual player's projections, you can do that as well. So Russell Westbrook we have with a 33.6 usage rate, but you could take that down to 31. You think it's going to be a little bit lower, and it moves by decimal points. You can also type over if you want, but the arrows is usually the best way to do it. But if you want to type over, you can. And you can see the statistics that are tied to usage rate, like points and turnovers. These have changed. His points have reduced. His turnovers has reduced. It's a net negative for him. So his overall DraftKings points have reduced. And it's really cool that those calculations happen on the fly. So the DraftKings points are automatically updated. The value projections automatically updated. You can see that conditional formatting changes a little bit as well. So that's really neat. You have the ability to do that not only with usage rate, but rebound rate, assist rate. One of the big ones is minutes. So let's say there's a situation on a night where a guy's questionable. If you wanted to fool around with minutes on some of the other players, if a guy's out, you can do that sort of thing. Or if you just think we're wrong, you could bump Russell Westbrook to 38. Opening night, you think they're just going to play him a whole ton. versus Golden State, a little bit of a rivalry there. And you can see everything updates according to now a 38-minute projection instead of a 36-minute projection.
So, Drew, when we're in this and we've finalized our projection, we've looked at the value, we've adjusted for how we want to do. You mentioned limits, you mentioned groups, and then the optimizer that can help you build your lineups as well. How do we go about setting those in a way where it's not super complicated all the time? Like, this is a 2-game slate. So let's say it was a 2-game slate, there's a 6-game slate. Do you have different limits baked in for each different type of setup?
So I think of it, every slate is unique. So not only in terms of the games, but in terms of the number of plays and the pricing and how plays shape out. So I don't necessarily have like baked in ideas for a 2-game versus a 6-game. It more or less depends on how many plays I'm comfortable with playing on a given night. But the way that I first look at things is I go into the settings tab, and from here I choose my global exposures. We've got a by position here: shooting guard, point guard, small forward, power forward, and center. And oftentimes on bigger slates, I might limit individual positions. Like I might not want shooting guards, usually a thin position. I might not want more than 40% of any one shooting guard player. So I can bring that down to 40. And then what will happen is in my lineups, all the shooting guards that you see, they'll have exposures that are limited to 40%. No one will go over. So I'll do that on each individual position. On a 2-game slate, I probably won't fiddle with that too much. I'll probably leave it around 100. Then from there, you can decide which positions you want in your utility. There's some slates where the forward position is just really weak, so I'll uncheck that, and that'll make sure that I have only guards and centers in my utility spot. You can choose how many uniques you want on a given lineup. So this just says, like, if my first lineup has 8 specific players, then the next lineup will have 1 different than the previous lineup at least. Sometimes I'll increase that level of uniques to get a little bit more of a broader set. And that'll also help reduce something that we like to call clumping, when a couple players that project really well tend to appear in all of the same lineups, because it is an optimizer. It is trying to optimize the projection. Using uniques or this shuffle feature that we have that's pretty cool can help reduce some of the clumping effects. And what we do with shuffle is it basically condenses the projections of the players on the top end and the bottom end to make the projections regress a little bit closer to one another, and then it takes a sample of them. So what you get is you get a wider distribution of the player pool, because it's saying some of these guys who are projecting as like really incredible values are just now great values, and some of the guys who weren't good values before are now okay values. And it kind of condenses the player pool and the projections. It gives you a wider distribution of players. And then the other thing that I like to do in the settings tab is choose which level of percentile outcome I'd like to optimize based off of. And this is off of Mike's range of outcomes projections. So we can optimize off the 10th percentile projection, or off the 90th or 75th, 50th percentile, if you choose, if you want to optimize off something rather than our base mean projections. You can choose a percentile to actually optimize off of, which I think is really, really cool and really interesting for tournaments where you might want to optimize a little bit more off of upside, and cash games where you might want to optimize a little bit more closer to the mean projection.
So, Mike, can you describe a little bit what, like, when you say the 90th percentile range of outcome, is that like their high end, that's their ceiling outcome, and 10% would be more like their floor, or do I have that backwards?
No, you have that exactly right. So 10% outcome, that means 10% of the time we'd expect a player to score at least that many or 90% of the time we'd expect a player to score at least that many fantasy points. It's kind of confusing because it's reversed a little bit. So, but the 90th percentile outcome, that means only 10% of the time would we expect a player to score at least that many fantasy points. So that's sort of how it works. So I think the 10th, 25th, the 4 percentile outcomes, 50th too, which would be your median, is good to help you kind of visualize some of the floor for cash game lineup type decisions. But I wouldn't straight optimize on that, because I think the mistake people make at times is, I want a really high floor lineup, but you still want ceiling in your lineups. And I'd really mostly focus on overall value, and then use the 10th, 25th, 50th percentile outcomes as more of tiebreakers. Whereas if I'm making my tournament lineups, there will be nights where I will optimize on the 75th, 90th percentile, because in order for you to win a GPP, you're going to need those type of performances, and the differences in value between players could shift a bit between their regular projection, their 90th percentile projection. I mentioned Like Drew, if you, for example, keep the ROO off, if you go back and check the slate, if you go to just utility for overall players, you can see like Durant is a 5.81 value, Embiid's 4.6. But if you want to go to the 90th percentile projection, I think that dynamic is going to shift a little bit, where they're like basically equal now. Whereas Durant was ahead a bit more. And you start to see some of those nuances a little bit. They're not going to be crazy shifts because it's stemming from the baseline projections, but it's enough that you might get that mix, especially if you're utilizing the shuffle feature, which just to expand on that, what Drew said. So every time a player is put into your lineup, they're a little bit less likely to be put in the next lineup. So if you've got a guy who's an insane value, his projection each time he's in a lineup in the back end is going to drop just a little bit. So he's still going to be in a lot of your lineups, but that helps a lot with the clumping issue that Drew talked about when he mentioned like you might have a small forward who's a punt projected for 20 points. And because you need a punt on the slate, he gets into 100% of your lineups when there's another small forward projected at 19 points and then maybe two more projected at like 18 and a half. So when you use that shuffle function, it's going to end up giving you a much more natural mix of those four small forwards instead of just defaulting to the one guy just because he projects a little bit ahead of everyone else. So I think that's a really important way to make your lineups in tournaments, is to utilize that shuffle feature at least a little bit. And the higher you make the shuffle number, the more a player's projection gets docked each time he's in a lineup. So the more broader mix you're going to get, the deeper into the player pool you're going to get, so on and so forth.
So, Drew, if it's someone like me and I want to test the waters with NBA, I'm probably not going to be playing 150 lineups per night. I'll probably play somewhere between like 3 and 10 if I want to get into it. Can you talk me through how much different you need to make some choices, hard choices, in those types of lineup when constructing things together for 3, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 lineups versus something like 50 or 100 or 150?
Yeah, I think the big difference is the more lineups you have, the lower overall exposure levels that you would have to individual players, because you'd want to take advantage of having all those lineups to be able to have a little bit more wider spread of the player pool. Whereas if you only have 3, 5, 10 lineups, something like that, you probably want to have higher exposure levels in terms of the max exposure levels on guys. So if I was playing 3 lineups, I might be willing to have a player in all 3 of my lineups. Whereas if I'm playing 150, I might not be willing to have that same player in all 150. And it's simply because you have more bullets to fire if you have 100 or 150 lineups to get a little bit more exposure to the rest of the player pool. So the fewer lineups that you have, I think the more you want to have kind of a concentrated core that you're working through. And certainly some slates, there's going to be like a 3K backup center that doesn't have a lot of foul trouble issues, that is now starting and we're projecting for 25 minutes, that you're going to want to play in all 150 lineups. But more often than not, there's going to be tighter constraints that you want to have the fewer number of lineups that you're able to enter into a GPP.
Can you explain the team limits and the grouping features that you can run through the optimizer to really maximize what you're up to?
Yeah, so the team limits page is here, and it's just saying the minimum number of players or maximum number of players you want from any individual team. And this is more useful on bigger slates where, for example, there might be a team, that's not a very good team, like in Atlanta or a Charlotte or one of the weaker teams. And you might say, hey, I think, they're not going to score a ton of points tonight. There's a couple guys that look like good values, but I don't necessarily want multiple players from this team in my lineup on this big 12-game slate or something like that. So I just drop down the max number of players down to 1 player per lineup or something like that. Conversely, there might be a team that has like 130 implied total on a given slate, and you're sitting there and there's tons of values everywhere, and you might say, hey, I need to have at least 1 Philadelphia 76er in all my lineups. And that's how you'd use these min or max features, which you can then save up at the top. The groups is just creating more rules for your optimizer. And in this group section, you can basically create rules where you say, if I have Westbrook in my lineup, then I don't want Harden in my lineup because those 2 players are so expensive. In this one, I'll go with Curry because we don't have Harden on this slate. So I'll create a group that just says Westbrook, Curry. I'll add those 2 players and I'll say I want at most one of those players in my 2 lineups. are in my lineup. So as a result, I just won't have Westbrook and Curry ever together, because if I do, I feel like then the rest of my lineup is going to suffer because they're so expensive. Or you can create like little stacks. Like let's say you think Westbrook, if he's going to have a big game, then Steven Adams is going to have a big game too, because he's going to get a lot of assists to Steven Adams. You can say, I want to make Russell Westbrook my key player, and every time Russell Westbrook is in a lineup, I will use exactly one of Steven Adams. Or you could add in Paul George and say, hey, I want Westbrook with teammates. I'll have at least one of Steven Adams or Paul George, or exactly one of Steven Adams or Paul George. So what this is saying is it's creating a rule that every time Westbrook gets in a lineup, the lineup optimizer is being told to choose exactly one of Steven Adams and Paul George alongside with him. So you can build like game stacks in here where you say like, hey, if I'm going to use Russell Westbrook and they're playing Golden State this slate, I want at least one of Curry or Durant or Klay Thompson in those lineups, and start to build game stacks that way, or correlations with individual players. The group setting and the keys are much more highly utilized in NFL, where stacking is much more common, but it also can be used in NBA to create individual correlation plays or game stacks as well.
Mike, can you walk us through some of the other tools beyond the optimizer that can help us get prepared for each individual slate?
Yeah, so we do have some other tools. For example, if you go to our team opponent tool, so what this is all based on last year's data right now. So the default is just the team statistics, standard statistics. You can see, points per game, rebounds per game, just your general statistics. You've got some shooting percentages. You can also see the opponent. So if you toggle onto opponent, this is what they've allowed. So Golden State allows 107.5 points per game to their opponents. I like using the advanced statistics quite a bit. And this has some of the more rate-based statistics, which helps us, I think, make our baselines a bit better. So offensive efficiency, that's points allowed per 100 possessions. Offensive efficiency is points scored per 100 possessions. Defensive efficiency, points allowed per 100 possessions. But you can also see some of those statistics that I talked about, rebound rate, assist rate, those types of things that you can use to change a player's projection. You can start to see them here. So the Warriors, for example, a lot of their possessions and their points scored are a result of assists. So they have an 86.7 assist rate, which is one of the highest in the league, second highest only to Philadelphia. And then pace is really important because that's where you're driving up possessions. And this is where you would look, Pat, you talked about looking at high-paced teams for NFL to target those games as stacks. This is where you can focus. And you can also translate this to the team limits things. Let's say the Pelicans and the Lakers are playing each other a night. And you wanted a game stack, you could make minimum 3 Pelicans, minimum 3 Lakers for some of your lineups to force a game stack of this. So that's one of the important tools. One of the other important ones is the advanced stats tab, which is going to be player specific. This is team specific. Advanced stats is player specific. So you're going to get a lot of the same data just on the individual level. And you can also toggle this in a lot of different ways. So you can, right now it's preset on just the full 2017-18 season. Again, you have your standard statistics. What's cool over on the right side is we have fantasy points per minute per game, which is, obviously important just to get a general baseline for players. You can also look at per 36 statistics, which helps because sometimes if it's a player that's going to step into a larger role, you kind of want to get a sense of how to compare them to other players. So their overall game statistics might not be as relevant as the per 36 statistics. And again, you've got the advanced tab, which allows you to look at the usage rate, assist rate, rebound rate. And it's really cool because we compare it to their last 5 or their last 10 games. You can see that little delta symbol, which says the change. So for example, LeBron James, his last 10 games of the season, his usage rate was actually 4.4 points higher than it was over the course of the entire season, which can just give you some idea of how roles on a team might be shifting, how you might want to mess with the customizable aspects of the position. The other tab that's cool is the scoring and values tab. And what this premium tool does is it tells you how often a player has scored either a certain amount of points or a certain amount of multiple times their DraftKings salary. which can be useful because we have that value column we have is based on a value threshold, which I believe is 4 times a player's salary plus 8. So if a player's $10,000, we would generally expect them to score 48 DraftKings points. So that's more relevant if you hit the values toggle. So this says Anthony Davis at that $10,900 price tag has hit his daily roto value threshold 65% of the time. This type of thing can be useful for both cash games and tournaments. Maybe you want to see how often does a player go crazy, and you can sort on 6x. And this will tell you, how many times a player scores 6x. It's not filtered by games, but what you can do is you can click the today toggle, and this will only bring up players that play today. Now, that doesn't work for right now because as we're recording this, there is no teams playing today. But and then back to the straight points. If you just want to see how many times a player scores, a certain amount of DraftKings points, you can do that. So LeBron James and Westbrook led the league last season, each scoring 70 or more DraftKings points 13% of the time. So it's just a really cool tool to visualize floor and ceiling for players.
Drew, is there anything else you want to highlight from inside the Daily Roto tools to really give people an advantage as it pertains to DraftKings NBA?
No, I think we've covered it for the most part. I mean, we've got the optimizer, we've got all these advanced stats tools, both on the team and the individual level. We've got thresholds that you can see how often players score. We'll have these range of outcome projections as well. There's a lot to be had at your disposal here to prepare you for the NBA season on any given slate. So I think we covered most of these tools pretty well, and these are tools that I know Mike and I created because these are things that we were researching on a daily basis, and we just wanted to share kind of a little bit of our research process with our subscribers. So that's basically all these tool ideas are born out of ideas that were things that Mike and I were, as we were playing, were like, hey, I'd really like to know this. This would be helpful in making this decision. Let's create a tool out of it.
All right, that will do it on the Pat Mayo Experience DraftKings NBA season preview, strategy, tips, and again, if you want to get a subscription and become a member at dailyroto.com, use the promo code THEPME. Boom. Get yourself 10% off, and you can go to dailyroto.com to find their specific tool tutorials as well, and it pertains to all the sports, so I'd recommend getting in. Remember, the PME to get yourself 10% off. You can follow Drew on Twitter at Drew Dinkmeyer and Mike at 2hats1Mike, and you can follow me at the PME on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Remember, subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience audio versions along with the video version. Highly recommend the video version for this one as we walk through all the tools. It'll be tough to visualize in your head unless you're already a subscriber at Daily Roto and going through at the same time. But so check out the video for this one. Remember to smash the like button. I'll be back with more tutorials, more strategy stuff as it goes along, as long as you guys continue to like it. But good luck in the NBA season in 2018 and 2019 and beyond. I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!